Didn't say recording in progress, but looks like it is. Yep. Okay. All right. So I got to make one minor correction to something I said last week, actually, and the week before. I don't know why I made this error. When we were talking about Wycliffe, I talked about a man who edited his work and it became the more popular version. And I kept calling him William Purvey. His name is Purvey. I got that right. But his first name is John. It's John Purvey and John Wycliffe. And I didn't realize it till I put the facsimile down and it says right on the cover, John Purvey. And I was like, I'm nearly certain I have been saying William Purvey this whole time. And I don't know why I said that. So that's it. We're not going back to Wycliffe after that, but I did want to correct that for anyone who's like, oh, I want to go get that facsimile. But he said William Purvey. It's John Purvey. It is John Purvey. All right. Now we're going to jump to Desiderius Erasmus. We didn't talk about him much last week. We introduced his name and we began to talk primarily about the world leading up to Erasmus. What's the world look like? What's going on in the world during Erasmus's life and what's transpired between Wycliffe and Erasmus. So we're about 82 years from Wycliffe's death to Erasmus's birth. Okay, so about 82 years. We had a little stopgap in between where we talked about Jan Hus and his prediction about the goose, or the swan, I should say, that will not be cooked nor boiled, and that Luther identified himself as that, and I think it's a good fit. But we're not there yet. Luther's still doing his thing. We're not talking about Luther yet. We're talking about Erasmus first, because this is going to be the guy that's going to really impact our translations massively over the next 500 years. This is going to be the source. All right, so what did it look like in Erasmus's day? Well, we always like to go back to the map and see what's going on in our map. We see that Spain had become a country. France is still a world power there. England is still a country. The Holy Roman Empire, as it's called, is this section here. It's not all one color, but this is made up of a bunch of different countries that are not independent from the Pope. And so the Pope oversees all of those countries. And then the major thing that has happened is the Ottoman Empire has become a world power. Okay, these are the Turks, and they have taken on the Byzantine Empire, and they finally conquered it. Byzantine Empire is gone now, and the Ottoman Empire is growing. Eventually, it's going to move its way over to the Holy Roman Empire, and it's going to take all of the North Africa, and it's going to become a huge world power for a short time. It's not going to last very long, but it is impactful. What is happening is going to impact our Bible translations. When I think I did talk about it here. Yes, I did. So when the Byzantine Empire falls, if you remember, we've talked about the Byzantine Empire right for a long time, going back all the way to the Latin Vulgate. When we were talking about the Latin Vulgate, we were talking about the Byzantine Empire back then. So we're talking about 1,000 years ago at this point that we were talking about the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire had growth and shrinkage and growth again. And when we were talking about Wycliffe, it was on its last leg. It was just barely holding on. And when the Ottoman Empire is taking over, I wanted to refresh your mind as who's over in the Byzantine Empire. Why have we been talking about them? Well, that's the Eastern Orthodox Church. When we were talking about the early church canons and things of that nature, we talked about the Eastern Orthodox canon versus the Roman Church canon versus the Protestant canon, versus the Coptic canon or the Ethiopian canon. And so we've got these guys over there, these Eastern Orthodox Christians, and they live in the Byzantine Empire. And when the Ottomans come and they start conquering, they start killing. They're slaughtering the Eastern Orthodox. And so they flee. And where do they flee to? Well, they flee west. And this is really important because this is when we get the Greek Septuagint, the Greek New Testament, and we also get the Masoretic text done by the Jews, all moving west into this area of the Western churches, and the Holy Roman Empire, again, as it's called there. And so we're going to see the Latin Vulgate meet the Greek Septuagint, meet the copies of the Greek New Testament that they have, and they're going to meet the Masoretic text. And so the Bible is going to have its own reformation. In the West, the Latin Vulgate is the received text. That's what everyone is using. Now, don't forget that when I said the Latin Vulgate and the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament, it's manuscripts. We're talking about lots of these existing. When scribes are doing work, they aren't always doing a complete Bible. They're doing portions of the Bible because that's what they have time to do. And so we have Gospels of John everywhere, but not necessarily attached, bound to the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. And so there are certain books that we find together. Actually, generally, that was probably a bad example because generally we do find the four Gospels together sometimes. And sometimes we find things like Luke and Acts put together. Sometimes we find just a copy of 1 Corinthians and just a copy of 2 Corinthians and just a copy of 2 Peter, because making a book is difficult. And so you make a portion of the Bible, and a lot of people make portions of the Bible, and some people are making a whole Bible, but that's not the norm. And it doesn't become the norm to start getting like whole, complete, bound Bibles for people. You might get it for a church. You might get it for a scholar. But for the everyday person, that's not going to be a thing until we get the invention of the Gutenberg press. We talked about, Johannes Gutenberg. He is a metal worker, and his trade in his day, what he was working on was metal mirrors. So he was polishing metal and he's trying to sell metal mirrors. And for whatever reason, this is not going well for him. His business is failing. And so he starts a new venture, and his venture becomes what we know as the Gutenberg press. And in order to make improvements on it, and in order to continue to make more presses and better presses, he sells indulgences for the Roman church, or he prints them. They buy them from him. So he's buying indulgences for the Roman church, selling them to the Roman church. And so they'll sell those to the laity. They'll pay him for that. And as fast as he can print them off is as fast as they're going to sell them. And then he does, the indulgences are generally single pieces of paper. And then he wants to do a complete book. This is the test. Can I produce a large amount of material in a short amount of time? And so the first complete book he prints is the Gutenberg Bible. Okay, the Gutenberg Bible around 1455 is when this is done. It's a 13th century edition of the Latin Vulgate. And so it promises to speed up the process of copying manuscripts. It promises to reduce the cost of production. It also promises to end the problem of scribal mistakes. So like, as scribes make mistakes, this will end that process. Well, it definitely does speed up the process of copying, without a doubt. It definitely does reduce the cost of production, without a doubt. However, I guess technically it does end scribal mistakes. What it does do, though, is introduce printing errors. And so now we'll have Bibles without scribal mistakes, but with printing errors. And standardized printing errors, because you're going to print off a whole bunch of them with that error, with the exact same error. So it's a new introduction to what kinds of errors can be introduced into our Bibles, but it's going to be a little less. What's the word I'm looking for? It's not going to be as inconsistent. The printing errors will be more consistent and easier to point out. Still today, it's considered one of the greatest inventions of humankind of all time. I think I mentioned that last time, and Miles went and fact checked me. And he said, I just typed in the word invention into Google, and the first thing that came up was the Gutenberg press. I was like, oh, there you go. Yeah, so this is going to be huge. The Gutenberg press is not just going to allow for people to get information out faster, which is true, but there's a lot of side effects to that. One is going to be literacy rates, right? When Bibles are hard to produce, hard to make, and expensive, the idea of having your own personal Bible, or your own personal book, I should say, is pretty far-fetched for most people. And if you did have your own personal book, it was highly valued, highly valued. And you didn't just let that go easily. You didn't misuse it. It was very expensive. It was a prized possession. Most people didn't have their own books. They were borrowing books from other people and passing them around. And that's how people would read if they had the opportunity to read at all. So literacy rates are going to go through the roof now because there's something to read and it's not expensive. We did talk about in Wycliffe's day, to get a full, complete Wycliffe Bible could be upwards of $500,000 in today's money. That is how expensive it could have been. That's not to suggest that people were necessarily paying that, but if we were to take the time and money and materials to make a Wycliffe Bible, that's what we're looking at for an investment, is easily $500,000. I saw some places valuing a Wycliffe Bible in Wycliffe's day as even 1.2 million were some estimates of the investment it took to make those. And if you saw the facsimile I had last week, it wasn't just text, it was art. It was beautiful. It was all done by hand. And you're talking perfect size characters in a perfectly straight line. It looks printed. Like, I can't write that good, not even remotely close to that good. My mom always jokes that I should have been a doctor. So the printing press takes the value of Wycliffe's Bible, let's say a $500,000 Bible, and in Gutenberg's early days, let's see, it would have been reduced to about 3 years' pay. So about 3 years' pay, let's say minimum wage pay, we'll say roughly 60 grand for a Bible in Gutenberg's day. So from 500,000 to roughly 60 grand. Still nothing to sneeze at. Like, that's an expensive Bible. But then we said, by the time Luther and Tyndale are around, we're looking at Bibles being roughly the cost of about 3 months' pay. And then let's say by the time the Geneva Bible and the KJV come out, you're looking at Bibles costing about 3 weeks' pay. Or is that right? Is that what I said? Yeah. About 3 weeks' pay. About 3 weeks' pay by the time the Geneva Bible and the KJV come out. It's about 3 weeks' pay. And it's only going to speed up from there. Obviously, today we have $6 Bibles if we want the cheapest possible Bible. We have $6 Bibles. We have $4 Bibles. I searching around, that was about the cheapest I could find, $4 to $6 for a full size, for a complete Bible, cover to cover, Genesis to Revelation. I saw a meme the other day that I thought was actually kind of funny, and it said that the Roman Catholic Bibles are a better value because you get 7 more books out of them. So anyway, it was a joke. I laughed. There's that. The other thing the Gutenberg press is going to do, is going to provide for us, is standardization of language. It's going to take language change and it's going to really slow it down, because as you print, as you're printing materials, you're coming up with standardizations on your own based on your target audience. And when you do that, you start to standardize languages more. And so countries start to have a language associated with them. England in English, and Spanish in Spain, and French in France. So you start having a cohesion of people around a particular language, which was something that was a much blurrier expectation before than it is now. And so we talked about even like the different dialects that England would have during that day before the printing press. And so the yellowish colors up here are all one dialect, but each shade is a slightly different version of that dialect. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then you've got these more distinct colors that would also be their own dialect, but their dialect would be a sharper contrast to ones of another shade, right? So all these pink would be similar in dialect, but still somewhat distinct, but much more distinct than the red or the blue or the green. To the degree that some linguists have said that there might have been actual language barriers. There would have been difficulty in communication just between the people who are in a different color. Okay, so they're all speaking English, but they're still having a hard time communicating with each other. Okay, it'd be one of those things that you could overcome. You just have to work it. Right? It wasn't a completely different language. It's just like, I don't understand what you're saying, and I feel like I should be able to. So there's that. One of the things that I think is helpful to understand in like philology or linguistics is that it's not always a clear, crisp line between something like a dialect, a pidgin, Creole. If you're familiar with those terms, maybe you're not, so I'll just describe them. Or in a completely separate language itself. There's not always a clear, distinct line. And so like a dialect is usually just another way of saying the same English, if you will. We use English as an example, right? So you understand dialects because when you go to Boston versus when you go to New York versus when you go to California versus when you go to Texas, that's American dialects. But then we have English dialects in England and the UK, and we have English dialects in Australia, and we have English dialects in India, and we have English dialects in South Africa, and they're all slightly different, and they all bring their own difficulties to communication. And then you've got pidgins, pidgin languages. Pidgin languages are essentially when you've got two cultures and two languages when they come together and they want to trade. Generally, that's what we see is they want to be able to do commerce with each other, and they can't communicate because they have different languages. And so they create a simplified language around the items that they're trying to work around, trying to sell and maybe communicate direction and things of that nature. And you get a simplified combination of two languages, maybe where they share some overlap, where they understand certain words, and you get a simplified language and it becomes a pidgin. And then that pidgin language begins to be commonly used among these two cultures. And then you get a generation that grows up knowing pidgin as their first language, and they begin to develop that language, and that language then becomes Creole. That's a Creole, is when a pidgin language starts developing some, what's the word? Not complications, but anyway, I can't think of the word. Let's see, did I put the note down? No, I didn't put the word down that I'm looking for. But anyway, a pidgin language, when it develops complexity, is the word I was looking for, is going to become a Creole language. All right, and then that language will become a language of its own, a new distinct language. Okay, and so that's how that works. And so sometimes it looks like you see this like border, and it's like this clear, crisp line between them. It's really not that clear. It's blurry. There's a lot of overlap. And so it'd be better if this map actually showed like shading into it. And they try to with the different colors, but with the boundaries, they make it look like it's just clear. You walk across the border and you've got that dialect. It's not always quite that clear. But anyway, that is the printing press is going to eliminate a lot of this. It's going to reduce it down to maybe a couple of dialects instead of all of these. Because as the printing press wants to print a lot of things, they're going to pick a dialect to print in, and they're usually going to print the dialect that is the largest or the most dominant. And then that one is going to just reinforce it in the other smaller dialects as they begin to read the same works. And you see the dialects begin to reduce. And so that's a big deal. Now, that's what information looks like in Erasmus's day. That's what's happening. we wanted to talk about also the rise of humanism. All right. The rise of humanism. As we said earlier, Erasmus was a Dutch humanist. Okay. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what humanism is, who's behind it, what's going on, what's their motivation, and how does this influence Erasmus. So the rise of humanism is going to come with a tagline called Ad Fontes. We'll talk about that more. But the first guy is going to be Francesco Petrarch, and he's contemporary with Wycliffe, and he's considered to be the father of humanism. And his early life, probably the first half of his life, is going to be lived in pretty much utter shame. He grows up and he becomes a priest of the Roman Church, but he becomes a priest without any real divine calling or any real heart for the spiritual. I would venture to guess he wasn't even a saved man. He lived a life of debauchery. He had many wives and many illegitimate children. And then he repented as a priest. And he talks about that Christ has replaced his debaucherous desires, that the Bible has replaced it, and he has a heart for God. And then he is concerned about the corruption within the Roman Church. And why wouldn't he be? He's in the Roman Church. He was the corruption. And he's not seeing it. He lived it. He was a Roman priest doing the debauchery. And I'm sure he wasn't the only one. He knew the people who were doing it along with him. And so he wants to see the church reform. And the way he wants to see the church reform is by going back to the classical authors. Going back to the classical authors. To them, that meant going back to early church Greek and early church Greek fathers, early church Latin fathers, and early writings. And so that is what it means to the sources. Ad fontes is let's go back. Let's go back. We're in a problem today. We need to go back to where we were. And so he had a love for the classical authors, the early church fathers. He had a love for not just the early church fathers, but also the secular authors. He loved Cicero. I didn't talk much about Cicero because it's not pertinent to our translations today, but Jerome was also a big lover of Cicero. Cicero, if I remember correctly, you can fact check me on this, but I think Cicero lived like in the 3rd or 2nd century, and Jerome loved him. So Jerome's later in life. He's 5th century. Jerome had such a love for Cicero that Jerome talks about a day in which he has a dream in which he felt like God was kind of talking to him. Actually, I don't remember if he attributed it to God, but he did have a dream. And in the dream, he's accused of loving Cicero more than the scriptures. And he's convicted. And he says, no more. I'm going to put Cicero to the side. The scriptures are going to be my primary focus. That's Jerome. Cicero, it's hard for me to get across to you what Cicero means to the early church fathers and what it means to even the humanists. But Cicero would be kind of like our Shakespeare today, right? We don't think of Shakespeare as necessarily a Christian work. We think of it as a secular work, but it's a beautiful work. We have high respect for what Shakespeare did. We see it as the height of art in that day. That was Cicero for the Latin people. Cicero was just the height of literary beauty, and people loved Cicero. And so he would go around looking for different manuscripts from classical authors. He found lost works of Cicero, things that people didn't have access to. He was able to find them in monasteries. He stopped to restore Livy's history from multiple manuscripts. So this was really interesting. Livy was contemporary with Christ. He is a Roman historian, 1st century, and Livy's history, as I understand it, was a work of beauty as well. It was a retelling of history, but it was done in such a way that it was compelling and that you wanted to read more and you wanted to read the next sentence. And so he was a great storyteller of history. And so Livy's works were considered high value. People really loved Livy's works. And what he sought to do is he would collect Livy's works, he would put their manuscripts together, and he would attempt to restore the original works of Livy. In other words, try to find the scribal errors. And so he was doing textual criticism on Livy's works. And he's the first to use the term that we call today the Dark Ages. Okay, we don't usually actually use that term, the Dark Ages. We use Middle Ages today, but he was the one that gave us the term the Dark Ages. And the reason he called it that is because he believed the world had come into a period in which they had forgotten the classical works. And because they had forgotten the classical works, they had fallen into a world of darkness, debauchery, and things of that nature. And so his way of fixing that was, let's go back to the classics, back to the sources. And so he begins the rise of humanism. Next one we're going to talk about is Lorenzo Valla. Lorenzo Valla, he will bring humanism to popularity, and he's also going to be massively influential on Erasmus, maybe more so than the other two men that I'm going to talk, the man I just talked about and the next man we'll talk about. This one might be the most influential on him. Lorenzo Valla becomes an expert in Latin. He is a Roman church priest and he's a teacher. Today, or even in I should say in Lorenzo's day and even in Erasmus's day, Valla is considered possibly the only equal to Valla's scholarship in Latin would be Jerome, is how he's viewed. Valla really wanted to go back to the beauty of Latin and the high-sounding Latin. Remember, Latin is not a spoken language, it's a dead language. And so some of that is being lost in the teaching that's being done in the Latin, and he wants to renew that. He gets a bunch of the manuscripts for the Apostles' Creed together. This becomes a big deal. And he puts the Apostles' Creed together. We call it the Apostles' Creed by tradition. I think Pastor had mentioned this in one of the times that we call it the Apostles' Creed, and there used to be a belief that the apostles wrote the Apostles' Creed. Well, it's Valla that debunks that. We know today that the apostles, and we might have known even before that, but this was a big deal in his day, that he debunks the idea that the apostles wrote the Apostles' Creed. Still a very valuable thing. We love the Apostles' Creed. It's a good thing to use, but it's not written by the apostles. And again, so Valla disrupts that. The next thing he does is he uses textual criticism to challenge the authenticity of Constantine's donation. This is really important. The Pope had been using this document called Constantine's Donation, or the Donation of Constantine, as remember that whole section of the Holy Roman Empire there? The Pope had been using that document as, hey, Constantine conquered this area and he gave this area over to the Pope. And so the Pope owns this now because of Constantine's donation. And so they would have secular authority over these areas because of the donation of Constantine. Well, Valla looks at it and he's like, well, there's anachronisms. There's words in here that Constantine never would have used. They didn't exist yet. There's bad phrasing. There's words that exist in Constantine's donation that Constantine himself doesn't use. They might have been contemporary with Constantine, but he doesn't use those words. Those aren't words. And then the dating of it and so on and so forth. And anyway, he works through the document and he says, this is a forgery. And he demands that the Pope, the papacy, give up their secular rule over these areas because he's proven that the papacy had forged, or someone had forged it, and the papacy was using this forgery to maintain their power. This is a big deal. And so that's that. The next thing he does, which is really interesting, this is going to be the thing that's going to motivate Erasmus. is as he travels around to different monasteries and he's getting different manuscripts, he's collecting Greek manuscripts because what's happening in his day? What's happening in his day? We have the Eastern Orthodox Church with their Greek manuscripts moving west. Well, Vala's collecting them. And he's comparing them to the Latin Vulgate. And he writes a book of annotations of all the differences between the Greek New Testament and the Latin Vulgate. He never publishes this work. It never goes public. Erasmus is going to find it later. Okay, he'll find it later in his own travels going around. He's going to find Vala's work. And then he's considered to be a champion of reason and truth. This is actually, so before I get there, his works eventually are condemned by the Roman Church, all of them, which is not surprising. However, he was never anathematized. He was never removed from the Roman Church. He never left the Roman Church. And he actually did have quite an impact on a couple of popes, to the degree that these popes began to finance the humanist movement. They saw it as a valuable thing. And so there were some popes that valued this in Vala's day, and they're financing it. And because of Vala's work, a particular Pope, Nicholas V, I believe, he sets apart a reading room for the collection of manuscripts. That reading room is established in 1453, so 2 years before the printing press does the Gutenberg Bible. And I believe it's 1453 also marks the end, the year that the Byzantine Empire is over. It's done. Constantinople is taken. And so you've got all of these manuscripts coming. And so 1453, this reading room starts collecting manuscripts. One of the manuscripts that's going to become important to our conversations later, so I'm going to just introduce it now, that comes over from the Byzantine area, is a Greek manuscript with a Greek Septuagint in it, and it's a complete Bible. We call this Bible today Codex Vaticanus. This Bible comes over from then, during this time, into this reading room. This reading room is going to grow, and it's going to evolve. And in 1475, this reading room will become what we call today, officially, the Vatican Library. And so that's where this comes from. And so Vala's kind of the guy that kicks this all off. And so that's pretty impressive. So he's considered a champion of reason and truth in the face of the Roman Church. Like Petrarch and Wycliffe before him, they don't mind exposing the Roman Church, but he never leaves the Roman Church. He dies in the Roman Church. Okay. Again, the Roman Church will condemn all of Vala's work later. Usually, it's going to be in response to the Reformation, because the Reformation is going to use Vala's works and the way he does things, his textual criticism and things of that nature. That's going to influence men like Erasmus. And the last guy we're going to talk about is Rudolf Agricola. Agricola. I read it Agricola, but then I heard someone say it, and I was like, oh, that's not how I would have pronounced that. Agricola. He's a Dutch humanist, and he's the father of German humanism. He will be the guy that influences Erasmus locally. He's in the same area as Erasmus. He'll be somewhat contemporary with Erasmus. Erasmus will be a very young man when Agricola dies. He's educated by the Brethren of Common Life. That's not going to mean a lot to you right now. It will mean more to you later. He becomes a professor of a nearby university, and he begins to teach the humanist philosophies, promoting going back to learning Latin and Greek. And then he's probably most famous for his work on the invention of the dialectic, which is a treatise on education itself. And in this work, he emphasizes the importance of the development of critical thinking. He thinks rote memorization is the wrong way to do education. Just memorize the facts and spit them out. Instead, he says, we need to focus on people being able to think critically, being able to debate, being able to have rhetoric, being able to be eloquent, These are the areas of education that he thinks are most important. He thinks students should be able to think for themselves and engage in meaningful intellectual conversation. That's a big deal for him. Agricola's ideas are influential in shaping educational practices even in his time, and they're still referenced even today. And yeah, so the very idea of liberal arts is something that he was really big on pushing. Liberal arts, a well-rounded education. That work he does it in 1470. And in that work, fascinatingly, he talks about how he taught a deaf person how to communicate both written and orally. This was something that in his day, didn't think could be done. They didn't believe deaf people could think rationally, that it was even possible for them to be intellectual. Our own Cherith Hunt's, I always call it Cherith Hunt's ministry would likely not be a ministry today if it weren't for Agricola. He reshapes how people view deaf people. In fact, things like sign language and stuff like that is going to come from his work. There's no evidence that he himself participated in sign language, as far as I'm aware. I don't know what methods he used to teach people, deaf people, how to read, write, and communicate orally, but he does do it, and it reshapes the deaf community. It's actually a pretty powerful, groundbreaking idea for his time. All right, so these three men, Petrarch, Valla, and Agricola, are going to be the three humanists that impact Erasmus. This is there's going to be other men. Jerome is going to be massively influential on Erasmus, but as far as humanism is concerned, it's going to be these three men that are really going to drive Erasmus's worldview and Erasmus's desires. We'll talk about that. So after 9 years after Valla dies, Erasmus of Rotterdam is born. And 4 years after he is born, Agricola will release that work that we just talked about. Erasmus and his brother are born to an unmarried couple, Gerard and Margaret, and they were prevented from being married. Gerard and Margaret were prevented from being married because Gerard was a Roman Church priest. And so Erasmus was an illegitimate son of a Roman Church priest. Erasmus later gives himself the name Desiderius, meaning desired. So he calls himself the desired Erasmus. When Erasmus was about 10 years old, his mother took him to a school about 100 miles away to attend a Latin school in Deventer, a prominent educational institution in the Netherlands. And there he received a rigorous classical education, laying the foundation for his scholarly pursuits. And that school in Deventer was renowned for its high standards and emphasis on classical literature and philosophy. So yeah, he was the illegitimate son of a Roman priest. And I already talked about that. And the name of the school was the Brethren of the Common Life, the same place that Agricola studied at. So you could say it's his I can't say the word. Alma mater. I think I said it close. Alma mater. So he would have been familiar with him because he's in the same area. He's graduated from the same school. And he's learning the classics there. This is a big deal. Erasmus embraced secular education. So this is interesting. So the brethren themselves, while he's introduced to all of these classics, they are also teaching somewhat against them, that all that was needed was the Bible. So here are the classics, but all you need is the Bible. The Bible is all you need. And Erasmus did not appreciate this teaching. He loved the secular education. And so he rejected their teaching, and he gave his heart over to secular learning, particularly the Greeks. He really loved the Greeks. Then, about age 16, Erasmus is orphaned because both of his parents die from the bubonic plague, which we had talked about in Wycliffe's day. While Wycliffe lived through it, the worst part of it, the plague was never actually just gone or wiped out for quite some time. Pockets of it would pop up in different places for short periods of time. And Erasmus's parents fell ill to that and died. And then after that, he joined an Augustinian monastery. This would be very much the same kind of monastery Luther would have been at. And the Augustinian monastery did not approve the learning of the Roman classics. And that's what he loved. He loved learning about the Greek and Roman classics. And so he's restricted from reading them. So he turned his attention from the classics during the day, and he studied Augustine and Jerome during the day. And then at night, in secret, he would study the Roman and Greek classics. Jerome became his particular love. He loved Jerome to the degree that he would begin to handwrite out Jerome's works so that he could have his own personal copy of them. All right. At night, his fascination was with Cicero. He loved Cicero as well. And another study he took on, he found Vala's works, Vala's study on Latin grammar. And so he learns through Vala how to write with excellency in the Latin language. And this becomes a thing he wants to push, is how to write with excellency in Latin. He begins to condemn other teachers and priests and so on for having a very barbaric form of Latin, that it wasn't smooth and beautiful and things of that nature. And he wants to bring that back. So this was actually tricky for him because Vala's works they're not condemned yet, but they're not looked upon kindly. He would not have been treated well had he been found with Vala's works. So he's reading them at night. He begins to write in 1490. It's called Against Barbarisms. And in this, it's essentially a polemic against those who would say secular education is unneeded. At this point, he is pushing for secular education. This work does not get published for another 30 years. It's the first work he does, but he can't get it published. Later, he's able to get it published, and that's because the Reformation is already well on its way. There's some disruptions. Printing presses are everywhere, and he has more access to do that. So while it's not his first published work, it is his first written work. And again, the point of this work is to give a correction for people who did not approve of secular learning. He's ordained as a Roman Church priest in 1492, but a year later, he decides to leave the monastery as he begins to detest everything monasteries stand for. And at that point, the Pope releases him of his monastic vows, and he becomes a secretary to a bishop for a short time, giving him permission to go to Paris. And while he's in Paris, I'm going to move quickly here. He is studying theology, but they have a scholastic approach. I'm not going to spend time on that, but the scholastic approach is kind of at odds with the humanistic approach. Okay, they don't agree. And so his scholastic approach here at Paris, he rejects it. He wants a more humanist education. He moves to England with a student in 1499, and that student introduces him to Thomas Linacre. And Thomas Linacre told Erasmus, seeing that Erasmus had a gift for languages, Greek, well, actually not Greek yet, but for Latin itself, that he had a strong passion for Latin, says that he needs to go to Italy to learn Greek. Why are they in Italy learning Greek? Because when the people after the Ottoman Empire crushes the Byzantine Empire, those Greek-speaking manuscripts that are coming with Greek-speaking people who can teach the language of Greek, and they can teach it as native speakers. And so the best and brightest of Greek are now in the West. And so he's going to go to Italy to learn. I won't spend much more time on that. But during this time, he's sitting under humanists teaching, and he's soaking it in. And he sits under one particular priest who is preaching on the book of Acts. And for the first time in Erasmus's life, he hears the book of Acts told as a history, that it's not just line upon what he would describe as just pedantic ideas, trying to pull out hidden ideas about Jesus in there. And instead, it's just teaching straight from the text in its context, talking about the culture of the day. And for the first time in Erasmus's life, he sees the Bible not just as a divine book, which it was, but it was also a classic book. It was a book that was historical, that had culture. It wasn't dead. He saw it as a dead book. Now he sees it as alive for the first time. He sees it on par with any other classical book, and he realizes this is what he needs to give his life to. And this becomes monumental for Erasmus in studying the classics. Now the Bible is part of, for the first time in Erasmus's life, the center of what it means to go back to the classics, is to go back to the Bible, particularly in Greek. And so I'll end with this. We'll pick this up next week. But Erasmus says this. This is one of his quotes. "When I get a little money, I buy books. And if I have any left, I buy food and clothes." So this becomes Erasmus's. He's very big into education and learning more. And he's a Rhodes Scholar, if you will. We will pick more up on Erasmus and some of his influential works next week, and then his most influential work, the Greek New Testament. And that is it for this class. You all are dismissed. Thank you.